The rain hammered against the stained glass windows of Grace Community Church as Pastor Michael Williams, 45 years old and weathered by a decade of faithful service, turned the heavy brass key in the sanctuary door. The storm had been relentless for 3 days, flooding the streets and driving temperatures down to an unseasonable chill for late October. As he stepped into the empty parking lot, his collar turned up against the wind. Something caught his eye near the church entrance. A figure huddled against the stone archway, barely visible in the dim glow of the security light. Drawing closer, Pastor Michael's heart clenched as he saw a young woman, perhaps in her late 20s, clutching a sleeping child to her chest. Both were soaked through, their clothes plastered to their bodies, shivering uncontrollably. The woman looked up as his footsteps approached, her eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. Sarah Martinez had been beautiful once, but weeks of desperation had carved hollow shadows under her cheekbones and dulled her dark hair. Her 5-year-old son Tommy slept fitfully in her arms, his small face flushed with fever. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "I just needed somewhere to get out of the rain for a few minutes. We'll move along, I promise." Pastor Michael felt his throat tighten as he recognized the profound desperation in her voice, the shame that comes with having nowhere else to turn. In this moment, everything he had ever preached about compassion and Christian duty crystallized into a simple choice between comfort and conscience. Without a moment's hesitation, Pastor Michael unlocked the church doors and ushered Sarah and Tommy into the warm sanctuary. The sudden change from the bitter cold to the heated interior caused both mother and child to shiver more violently as their bodies began to thaw. In the soft light of the altar candles, Pastor Michael could see the full extent of their situation. Sarah's shoes were held together with duct tape, and Tommy's jacket was 3 sizes too small, his thin wrists exposed to the elements. As they settled into a pew near the back, Sarah's story began to unfold in halting, embarrassed whispers. She had worked as a housekeeper at the Riverside Inn, pulling double shifts 6 days a week to support herself and Tommy after her husband left them 2 years ago. The work was backbreaking, but it paid enough for a small apartment in a decent neighborhood where Tommy could attend a good school. Everything changed 3 weeks ago when the hotel's owner declared bankruptcy overnight, closing the doors without warning and leaving 43 employees without jobs or final paychecks. "I had some savings," Sarah explained, her voice growing stronger as she spoke, "but it went fast. First the rent, then the motel when we got evicted. When that money ran out—" She gestured helplessly at their bedraggled appearance. Pastor Michael listened with the patience of someone who had counseled countless troubled souls, yet each story of hardship still moved him deeply. He thought of Matthew 25:35. "I was a stranger, and you invited me in." Ooh, the words seemed to echo in the empty sanctuary, a divine whisper urging him toward a decision that would change everything. "You and Tommy will stay here tonight," Pastor Michael said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of a man accustomed to making difficult decisions. "The church has a small room behind the sanctuary that we use for visiting ministers. It's not luxurious, but it's warm, dry, and safe." Sarah's eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with the cold. She had spent weeks being turned away from shelters, told that resources were limited, that there were waiting lists, that she needed to try somewhere else. The kindness of this stranger, this man of God, felt like a miracle she had stopped believing could happen. Tommy stirred in her arms, his fever-bright eyes focusing on the pastor's kind face. "Are you God?" the little boy asked, with the directness that only children possess. Pastor Michael chuckled softly. "No, son, but I work for him." Within the next hour, the pastor had transformed their desperate situation entirely. He found clean, dry clothes in the church's donation closet, prepared a simple meal of soup and sandwiches in the fellowship hall kitchen, and made up a comfortable bed with fresh linens. As Sarah helped Tommy into pajamas that actually fit, she watched Pastor Michael move with quiet efficiency, asking nothing about their past, making no judgments about their circumstances. When Tommy was finally settled under warm blankets, his fever beginning to break, Sarah found herself crying silently in gratitude. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps they weren't entirely alone in the world. Pastor Michael, watching this small family find peace, felt the deep satisfaction that comes from living one's faith rather than merely professing it. What began as emergency shelter for one night gradually extended into a week, then 2, then 3. Pastor Michael found himself looking forward to his evening visits with Sarah and Tommy, who had transformed the usually silent church into something approaching a home. Sarah proved to be remarkably resourceful and grateful, quietly taking on cleaning and organizational tasks that the church custodian had been neglecting for months. The brass fixtures gleamed, the fellowship hall had never been more organized, and even the church library had been reorganized with a system that actually made sense. Tommy, despite their circumstances, revealed himself to be a bright, curious child who found wonder in the most unexpected places. He spent hours studying the stained glass windows, creating elaborate stories about the biblical figures depicted there. His favorite was David and Goliath, which he reenacted with pencils and erasers on the sanctuary floor. Sarah had been walking miles each day, applying for every job she could find, from fast food restaurants to office positions. The job market remained challenging, especially for someone without a permanent address or reliable transportation. Each evening brought the same disappointed report, but Sarah never complained, never expressed bitterness about her situation. She maintained a dignity that impressed Pastor Michael deeply. During their dinner conversations, he learned about her dreams for Tommy's education, her hopes of perhaps returning to college herself someday to become a teacher. These weren't just temporary residents taking advantage of his kindness. They were real people with real aspirations, temporarily derailed by circumstances beyond their control. The pastor began to realize that this arrangement wasn't just helping them. It was enriching his own understanding of ministry and purpose. The secret arrangement couldn't remain hidden forever. On a Tuesday morning in early November, Elder James Harrison arrived an hour early for a scheduled board meeting, intending to review financial documents in his characteristically thorough manner. At 62, Harrison was a successful commercial real estate developer who had built his fortune through careful attention to detail and strict adherence to proper procedures. His substantial financial contributions had funded the church's new roof and organ restoration, earning him considerable influence among the congregation. As he unlocked the side entrance with his master key, he heard unfamiliar sounds coming from the direction of the fellowship hall. A child's laughter and a woman's voice singing softly. Following the sounds, he discovered Sarah helping Tommy with his breakfast while organizing church bulletins for the upcoming Sunday service. The shock on Harrison's face quickly transformed into barely controlled anger as he realized the implications of what he was seeing. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice echoing through the hall. "What are you doing in this church?" Sarah instinctively moved to shield Tommy, explaining in halting words that Pastor Michael had given them permission to stay temporarily. Harrison's face reddened as he processed this information. "This is absolutely unacceptable," he declared, pulling out his phone to call the pastor immediately. "Michael, you need to get down here right now. We have a serious problem." The confrontation that followed would test not only Pastor Michael's resolve, but the very foundation of what Grace Community Church claimed to represent. Elder Harrison's shock at finding unauthorized residents had awakened his deepest concerns about liability, propriety, and the church's reputation in the community. Pastor Michael arrived within 15 minutes, finding Elder Harrison pacing in the parking lot while Sarah and Tommy waited anxiously inside. The confrontation was immediate and heated. "This is completely inappropriate and potentially illegal," Harrison began, his businessman's instincts focused on risk management and institutional protection. "We have insurance concerns, liability issues, and what about proper background checks? These people could be anyone, criminals, drug addicts, mentally unstable. You've put the entire congregation at risk." Pastor Michael attempted to explain the humanitarian circumstances that had led to his decision, describing the night he found them in the storm, Tommy's fever, Sarah's obvious desperation and subsequent gratitude. But Harrison was unmoved by emotional appeals. "I understand your heart was in the right place," he said with forced patience, "but good intentions don't protect us from lawsuits if someone gets hurt, if there's a fire, if something goes wrong. The church is not a homeless shelter, Michael. We have procedures, protocols, proper channels for helping people like this." He gestured dismissively toward the building where Sarah and Tommy waited. "We have a benevolence fund, a food pantry, connections with legitimate social services. That's how we help the needy, through established proper channels." The argument continued for nearly an hour, with Pastor Michael defending his actions as consistent with Christian principles, while Harrison insisted on institutional propriety. Finally, Harrison delivered his ultimatum. "Call an emergency board meeting for tonight. The other elders need to know about this situation immediately, and that woman and child need to be removed from church property before we face serious consequences." The battle lines had been drawn, and Pastor Michael realized his decision to help Sarah and Tommy would now cost him far more than he had originally anticipated. The emergency board meeting that evening was unlike any in the church's history. The 7 elders gathered in the small conference room behind the sanctuary, their faces reflecting various degrees of concern, confusion, and outright disapproval. Pastor Michael sat at the head of the oval table, feeling isolated as Harrison presented his case with the precision of a corporate attorney. "Pastor Williams has violated established church policy, exposed us to significant liability, and acted without board approval on a matter of considerable importance," Harrison argued, distributing copies of the church's insurance policy and liability coverage. "What precedent does this set? Do we become a homeless shelter for anyone who shows up at our door?" Elder Margaret Foster, a retired elementary school principal in her 70s, spoke more gently but reached the same conclusion. "Pastor, while your compassion is admirable, we must consider the implications for our congregation. What if other homeless individuals begin arriving, expecting the same accommodation? What if there's an accident, a fire, or worse?" Elder Robert Chen, 35 and the youngest board member, attempted to defend the pastor's position. "Didn't Jesus specifically instruct us to welcome strangers and care for those in need? Aren't we called to be more than just a Sunday morning social club?" But his voice was lone dissent in a chorus of institutional concern. Elder Patricia Williams, no relation to the pastor, worried about the example being set for the congregation's children. Elder Thomas Burke questioned whether proper legal procedures had been followed. Elder Dorothy Reed expressed concern about the church's reputation in the community. When the vote was finally called, it was 6-1 against allowing Sarah and Tommy to remain on church property. Only Elder Chen voted in favor of supporting the pastor's decision. The board's mandate was clear. Sarah and Tommy had 48 hours to vacate the premises, and Pastor Michael was formally censured for acting without proper authorization. Returning to the church that night to deliver the devastating news felt like the longest walk of Pastor Michael's life. He found Sarah in the fellowship hall, helping Tommy with a homework assignment under the warm lamplight, a scene of domestic tranquility that made his task exponentially more difficult. The peace on their faces, the sense of security they had finally found, would be shattered by his words. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said softly, his voice heavy with the weight of impending disappointment. As he explained the board's decision and their ultimatum, he watched hope drain from Sarah's eyes like water from a broken vessel. Her shoulders sagged as the familiar mask of resignation settled over her features, the same defeated expression she had worn when he first found her in the rain 3 weeks ago. "I understand," she said quietly, though her voice trembled with suppressed emotion. "I knew this was too good to last. We'll be gone by tomorrow morning." Tommy looked up from his arithmetic worksheet, his pencil frozen in mid-calculation. Though only 5 years old, he had developed an acute sensitivity to adult conversations that signaled unwelcome changes in his small world. "Mama, are we going back to the car?" he asked, with the devastating innocence that only children possess. Sarah's composure nearly cracked, but she managed a trembling nod. "Just for a little while, sweetheart, until Mama finds us a new place." Pastor Michael felt as though he were betraying everything he had ever believed about Christian duty and human compassion. He was choosing institutional preservation over individual need, protocol over people, his position over his principles. The hypocrisy of preaching about God's love while turning away those most in need of it weighed on his soul like a stone. That night he would not sleep, wrestling instead with the most fundamental questions of his calling and conscience. Pastor Michael spent the entire night walking through his empty parsonage, unable to find peace or rest. He moved from room to room like a restless spirit, haunted by the image of Tommy's confused face and Sarah's resigned acceptance of yet another rejection. In his study, surrounded by theological books and seminary awards, he found himself questioning everything he had ever learned about ministry and faith. The comfortable theories and academic discussions seemed hollow when confronted with the reality of human suffering. Around 3 in the morning, he opened his Bible to Matthew 25 and read Jesus' words about the final judgment. "I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in." The passage continued with Jesus explaining that whatever was done for the least of these was done for him. The message seemed unmistakably clear, yet he was being forced to act against every fiber of his conscience and calling. As dawn broke through his study window, Pastor Michael made a decision that would fundamentally alter the course of his ministry and his life. He would not comply with the board's directive. Sarah and Tommy would stay, and he would take full responsibility for the consequences of that choice. If the board wanted them removed, they would have to remove him first. At 7 o'clock that morning, he called Elder Harrison and requested another emergency board meeting for that evening. His voice carried a new quality that Harrison had never heard before, quiet steel wrapped in pastoral gentleness. "We need to discuss this situation further," Pastor Michael said simply. "I have something important to tell you all." The second battle was about to begin, and this time Pastor Michael would not surrender without a fight that tested everyone's true commitment to the principles they claimed to hold sacred. The second emergency board meeting convened with an atmosphere of tense anticipation. The elders expected to hear confirmation that Sarah and Tommy had vacated the premises and that their pastor had learned to respect proper authority and procedure. Instead, they found Pastor Michael standing before them with a quiet determination they had never witnessed in their decade of working together. His usual diplomatic demeanor had been replaced by something far more resolute and spiritually grounded. "Sarah and Tommy are staying," he announced without preamble. "I take full personal and professional responsibility for this decision and whatever consequences may follow. If you cannot support a pastor who chooses to follow his conscience in matters of basic human compassion, then I understand you may need to find someone who better fits your vision of ministry." The silence that followed was deafening. Elder Harrison's face cycled through several shades of red before settling on a deep purple that suggested barely controlled rage. "You're willing to sacrifice your career, your position, everything you've built here over 10 years, for two complete strangers?" he demanded, his voice rising with each word. Pastor Michael nodded with calm certainty. "They're not strangers anymore, James. They're part of our community now, and I will not abandon them to satisfy institutional convenience or legal paranoia." Elder Foster leaned forward, her teacher's instincts seeking to understand this sudden transformation in their normally accommodating pastor. "Michael, what's changed? You've always been willing to work within established procedures before." Pastor Michael smiled sadly. "I've realized that sometimes following Christ means standing against the very institutions that claim to represent him. Tonight, I'm choosing faith over fear, people over policy, conscience over comfort. If that costs me this position, then perhaps it was never the right position for me." The confrontation had escalated beyond mere policy disagreement into a fundamental theological and philosophical battle for the soul of Grace Community Church. Word of the escalating conflict between Pastor Michael and the church board spread through the congregation with the speed that only small-town controversies can achieve. By Sunday morning, Grace Community Church buzzed with whispered conversations, divided loyalties, and intense speculation about the ultimate outcome. Some members had heard rumors about homeless people living in the church, while others had gotten second-hand accounts of heated board meetings and pastoral rebellion. The sanctuary filled beyond its usual capacity as curious members, and even some visitors came to witness what many suspected might be Pastor Michael's final sermon. As he stood behind the familiar pulpit, looking out at faces that reflected every possible emotion from anger to support to confusion, Pastor Michael felt the weight of his decision settling around his shoulders like a mantle. His sermon that morning was unlike any he had ever delivered, passionate, personal, and uncompromisingly direct about the church's responsibility to the vulnerable. "Faith without works is dead," he proclaimed, his voice carrying across the packed sanctuary with newfound power. "We are called to be living demonstrations of God's love, not merely theological debating societies. Today, we have an opportunity to show this community what Christian compassion looks like in action, not just in Sunday morning platitudes." In the third pew, Sarah sat with Tommy, both dressed in their best donated clothes, feeling the weight of dozens of stares and whispered comments. Some faces in the congregation showed genuine warmth and acceptance, while others reflected discomfort, judgment, or outright hostility. Elder Harrison sat rigidly in his customary front pew, his disapproval radiating like heat from a furnace. When the service ended, the usual polite post-worship socializing was replaced by clusters of intense discussion, with members clearly choosing sides in a conflict that threatened to split the congregation down the middle. In the days following Pastor Michael's controversial sermon, Grace Community Church began to reveal its true character as individual members were forced to choose between comfort and conviction. The response was both heartening and heartbreaking in its diversity. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, an 80-year-old widow whose husband had been a founding member of the church, arrived the next morning with homemade meals and an offer to help with Tommy's childcare needs. "I've been widowed for 15 years, she told Sarah warmly, "and this church family sustained me through my darkest hours. Now it's my turn to help sustain you. The women's ministry, led by Ellen Morrison, quietly organized a rotation of assistants that included everything from job interview coaching to children's clothing donations. The youth group, inspired by their pastor's stand, organized a fundraising car wash specifically to help Sarah save money for a security deposit on an apartment. However, the division within the congregation was equally apparent and increasingly bitter. Elder Harrison had begun conducting his own meetings with dissatisfied members, building a coalition to force Pastor Michael's resignation. He argued that the pastor's actions demonstrated poor judgment and disregard for proper authority that could lead to chaos and potential legal disaster. Several long-time members expressed their concerns to anyone who would listen, worried that their church was becoming too political, too socially active, too different from the quiet, comfortable place of worship they had known for decades. The Hendersons, a prominent family who had attended for over 20 years, announced they were looking for a new church home. The Caldwells stopped their monthly tithing in protest. Yet through all the controversy and division, Sarah continued to contribute however she could, cleaning the church with renewed dedication, helping in the nursery during services, and maintaining a dignified gratitude that impressed even some of her initial critics. 3 weeks into the standoff, on a crisp November morning that seemed to promise new possibilities, Sarah burst into Pastor Michael's office with news that would change everything. Through a connection made by Mrs. Patterson, whose late husband had served on several non-profit boards, Sarah had been offered a position as office manager at the Greater Metropolitan Food Bank, a well-established organization that served the entire county's hungry population. The job came with a decent salary, health benefits, and the deep satisfaction of helping others who faced the same struggles she had recently experienced. Even more miraculous, through Elder Chen's work in property management, she had found an affordable 2-bedroom apartment in a safe neighborhood with good schools, available for immediate occupancy with a reduced security deposit. "I can hardly believe it's real," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face as she shared the news. "A month ago, Tommy and I were sleeping in our car, and now we have a future again." Pastor Michael felt a profound sense of vindication and joy, not because his position had been proven right, but because the risks he had taken had led to this moment of genuine transformation and hope. The news of Sarah's employment and housing spread through the congregation like wildfire, and even some of Pastor Michael's harshest critics began to reconsider their positions. Perhaps, they admitted privately, there had been divine purpose in what had seemed like pastoral stubbornness. Elder Foster approached Pastor Michael after hearing the news. "Maybe," she said thoughtfully, "God was working through your decision in ways we couldn't see at the time." The success story provided powerful evidence that sometimes faith requires taking risks that seem foolish to human wisdom, but prove providential in retrospect. For Sarah and Tommy, it represented not just material security, but the restoration of dignity and hope that had been stripped away by circumstances beyond their control. 6 months later, on a warm spring evening in May, Grace Community Church held its annual potluck dinner and fellowship celebration. The fellowship hall buzzed with laughter, conversation, and the comfortable chaos of a church family gathering. Sarah, now assistant director at the food bank after a rapid promotion, moved through the crowd with confidence and joy. Tommy at her side, wearing his Little League uniform and proudly showing off his first-place spelling bee certificate. They had become integral members of the congregation, with Sarah serving on the missions committee and Tommy participating in the children's choir. Pastor Michael watched them with deep satisfaction, knowing that his decision to risk everything for their welfare had transformed not just 2 lives, but an entire community's understanding of Christian love in action. The crisis had ultimately strengthened the church, though not without cost. Elder Harrison and 3 other board members had left to join a more conservative congregation across town, taking their financial contributions with them. But new members had joined, drawn by the church's demonstrated commitment to living their faith rather than merely professing it. Elder Chen had been elected as the new board chairman, bringing a vision of ministry that balanced practical wisdom with bold compassion. The church's reputation in the community had actually improved, with local social service agencies now regularly referring people in need to Grace Community Church's expanding benevolence programs. As Pastor Michael offered the closing prayer for the evening, thanking God for the blessings of community and the courage to do what is right even when it is difficult, he reflected on how one moment of human compassion had rippled outward to transform an entire congregation's understanding of their calling. Tommy's voice joined the Amen with enthusiastic volume, a reminder that sometimes the most profound theological lessons come not from seminaries or systematic studies, but from the simple act of opening our doors and hearts to those whom society has forgotten. Thank you for listening to this story of faith, courage, and the transformative power of human compassion. In a world that often seems divided between self-interest and sacrifice, Pastor Michael's story reminds us that sometimes the right choice isn't the easy choice, but it's always the choice that honors our deepest values and beliefs. Please let us know in the comments what part of the world you're listening from. We love connecting with our global community of listeners who believe in the power of kindness to change lives. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell for more inspiring stories that challenge us to be better versions of ourselves. Your support helps us continue sharing these meaningful tales of human resilience, faith, and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it costs everything.